Mhm.
Dr. Collins, welcome again. I'm holding up this book for those of you who can't see. It's called The Road to Wisdom on Truth, Science, Faith, and Trust by Francis Collins. And so I want to kick it off with a question about the book itself. Look, you wrote a lot in the book about how we arrive at truth. And one of the things, and I've actually been sharing this anecdote with many people, you write about a core center that is necessary truth, and in it you talk specifically about this idea of like, we can all agree on 2 + 2 = 4. And I got to tell you, Dr. Collins, when I heard that, there was like, of course, I know that 2 + 2 = 4, but it was so nice to actually see a statement that I feel
Like we're
like
good with that. Put that
like
aside.
everyone can agree on, that like somebody I completely disagree with politically can be like, I disagree with who you voted for, I disagree with your politics, but yes, 2 + 2 = 4. Tell us about that analogy and what you were hoping to sort of kind of communicate by telling us that story about starting with 2 + 2 = 4.
Well, a couple of things. And again, it's great to be with you all today. One is that there really is such a thing as objective truth, because in some circles, there seems to be some fragility in that claim. And it seems okay to say, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me. And that's fine if we're talking about the opinion of the latest movie. But if it's about whether the earth goes around the sun or the other way around, it's not okay to just disagree with the fact because you don't like it. Objective truth has been a critical part of our society's ability to make progress. And we have this body of established facts, which in my book is sort of one of the circles that I talk about, that really shouldn't be a matter of opinion. And yet, increasingly, with everybody off in their tribal bubbles, you're allowed to say that established fact actually doesn't suit me. Um, the more that we do that, the more we're really headed into chaos. And a lot of that is happening. Now, outside of that circle of established facts are the zone of uncertainty, where there's evidence kind of pointing this way, but not everybody can sort of see that that's conclusive. And frankly, it isn't. And so that's a place where we should have reasoned, thoughtful, non emotional discussion if we're trying to talk about facts. And then outside of that is the matter of opinion, and have people having different opinions doesn't threaten the order of things, and that's fine. But where we get into trouble so often is we start arguing about something and we forget which circle we're in. And if it's the circle of established facts, let's actually look at the facts.
Mm.
Let's not quote the social media posting that I read last night from somebody I never heard of because it sounded so compelling and it resonated with what I was mad about today. That's where we have really lost our way, I think, in terms of how we engage in meaningful societal discourse about almost everything. And this all sort of intersects with the theme of this podcast, which is trust. Because
Yeah.
if you mistrust information, you're likely to get confused about established facts and what is true and what is not. And let me just say another word about trust. I think traditionally there were sort of three ways that we, without thinking about it, made decisions about whether to trust an individual or an institution as giving us reliable information. One was, do they have integrity? And they have a track record of being honest. Okay, that would be good. Are they competent? Do they have expertise? Have they done the work? Have they really delved into a field deeply so that they know all the pros and cons in the background? And third, and this one gets forgotten about, but I think it's important, is do they have humility? Are they able to say, well, I'm really an expert on this thing, but I'm not an expert on everything? So accept my advice, if you will, in this place where I've done the work, but don't imagine just because I'm a celebrity that I can tell you what's good for your diet.
Mm.
Those three, I think, are pretty dependable, pretty useful to kind of use as your own filtering when information is coming at you. Integrity, competence, humility. Are we okay there? Then maybe I should pay attention to that. But there's a fourth one that used to be a small factor and now seems to be a very big factor, almost to the point where it overrules the rest. And that is, does this source share my values? And that could be okay if it's like, do they have a moral compass? But if
Mhm.
it's, does this source live in my bubble? Do they read the same things that I do? Do they follow the same news media sources? Then you can quickly get skewed, where something that's being revealed to you in terms of new information that actually is full of integrity and competence and humility gets rejected because it came from those other people over there that we don't trust anymore because they're wrong about everything and they're probably evil. And similarly, maybe something's coming at you that's absolutely bogus, in which a bit of investigation would make it clear to you that, well, for instance, the Earth is not flat, even though there are people who belong to the Flat Earth Society. You might accept that because I like those people; they're my people. So I'm going to say, yeah, that's probably true.
Gosh, your book is, I really, really recommend it to people who are struggling with kind of how we arrive at truth and where truth is standing today. You wrote, and let's talk about the competence piece
Mm,
of that metric. You wrote that a good way to go is to consider what is the source of information and does that source represent real expertise,
yeah.
which seems like solid, good advice. Without getting into Robert F. Kennedy Jr. himself, but just I'd like to talk about this approach that we're seeing, this questioning that we're seeing. He told Tucker Carlson the other day that, quote, we need to stop trusting the experts. He said that we were told in the beginning of COVID, don't look at any data yourself, don't do any investigation yourself, just trust the experts. And trusting the experts is not a feature of science. It's not a feature of democracy. It's a feature of religion and it's a feature of totalitarianism. So I just would love you to kind of unpack that approach, which we're seeing today, which is you can't trust and you shouldn't trust the experts. You've got to figure this out for yourself. Otherwise, you're just being led, off the cliff.
Well, it's a very dangerous assertion. Let me just be really clear about that. If you're going to discount the fact that some people actually do have greater knowledge about a particular area and immediately therefore say, well, that's an expert, so I shouldn't listen to them, then you're throwing away the vast array of human knowledge that we should be depending on in our daily life in order not to make terrible mistakes, in order to help ourselves and our families flourish. That's how society has made the progress that we have. Now, of course, okay, let's be sure when you say expert, what is the source of that expertise? We were just talking about that. Do they have competence and integrity and humility? And be sure that that's a merited assertion of being an expert and not just something you accept because somebody else said so. But I am deeply troubled about this trend. There's a whole book called The Death of Expertise, which is truly sobering. Imagine if that actually took hold on our society. Well, first of all, it's hard to imagine doing that. Are you going to suddenly decide, I'm not going to take my car to the mechanic anymore because I don't trust the mechanic? He's an expert who thinks he knows about carburetors. I'm going to do my own research and I'm going to figure out how to get this thing running again. Can you imagine how successful that would be? So, why do we think that expertise about health is somehow simpler than your car, and that therefore you can do your own research and come up with the right answer, especially when the internet is loaded, as we all know, with all kinds of information that's just plain wrong? And it makes it very hard, therefore, to sift through it and figure out what you should trust if you haven't spent your time becoming really grounded in that area, which is what the experts can do for you. So, yeah, be a little skeptical, but don't discount the value of expertise. It is our best hope for making progress in so many ways.
Yeah, and I hear you. It's like when I board a flight, it's not like I go into the cockpit and I'm like, "Are you sure you can fly this plane?" Um, I'd say that where some of that comes from, Dr. Collins, and I'm sure you've heard this, because we hear this from the folks from our listeners, which is when you have systems that are now being influenced by what they see as being perverse incentives, not across the board, but in many examples. They see what happened during the opioid crisis and with big pharmaceutical industries. They see, a massive government effort to get us into wars for reasons that were ultimately false. And they see during COVID examples of what they find as being government overreach. And in their case, they often say they view it as lies that were told to them. I guess, it's almost like, sure, the literal expertise of folks who are brain surgeons and mechanics and pilots. I don't know that we would even find many folks amongst our listener base who would challenge that. But I wonder if you see some truth to this notion that we have been let down by expertise and institutions, and how do you that there have been cases of that, and how do you both hear that, but yet also reassure that that doesn't necessarily mean that we should kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater?
Yeah, that's the right question. And I think the problem right now is we are doing a lot of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. You can, in any institution, any circumstance, find examples where things went wrong, where information was spread around that turned out to be in some way conflicted by the source, and misled people. That's not a new thing. That's been going on as long as we've had human societies. But the tendency now is to identify circumstances like that and then extrapolate and say, well, if that particular situation represented a bad recommendation that we should not have trusted, then the whole thing needs to be thrown out. And there's a lot of that happening right now, especially in medical research and in public health. But one needs to look at the counter. Let's talk about the COVID mRNA vaccine, for instance. Now, there's a circumstance where, because of some information, which frankly is mostly misinformation, has convinced some people that those COVID mRNA vaccines maybe weren't safe. We do know that about 1 in 10,000 young men with receiving that vaccine, oftentimes the second dose, had the incidence of myocarditis, which blessedly and wonderfully was virtually all reversible. That is the one thing that one can say really was a consequence, a rare one indeed, and one which was reversible. But in the mindset of a lot of people, including people who currently have a lot of authority in our government, there was a terrible thing that happened here, and there was a hiding of risks of this vaccine. And that information became very much viral in the course of 2021. And the consequences were just really severe. I got to say this. In 2021, by June, if you wanted a vaccine for COVID, you could get one. It was widely available. It was free. There was no reason not to. At that time, myself working at NIH, I thought we're going to actually be able to save the terrible loss of life that's happening. And then it became clear that more than 50 million Americans, because of distrust, were saying, nope, it's not for me. The Kaiser Family Foundation did this analysis very carefully to figure out the consequences of that over the next 9 months of people who chose not to be vaccinated because of misinformation. The estimates are 234,000 of them died. That's like 2 jumbo jets crashing every day for 9 months. And yet we're not even quite talking about that.
Yeah.
And that's evidence, that's science, those are facts. That's not just me giving you some sort of idea about what the truth was. That is in that zone of established facts that we should all be able to look at, as hard as it is, and try to learn from. And yet, here we are in 2025. And if anything, it seems like the pendulum has swung more in the direction of saying, well, vaccines for COVID were maybe a dangerous thing. And by the way, mRNA is a dangerous thing, and we shouldn't be studying that anymore, even though it won the Nobel Prize for the people who brought it forward and has saved, by most estimates worldwide, somewhere between 14 and 20 million lives. What
Yeah.
has happened if it's that easy to take expertise and discount it because you didn't like the answer or a politician said you shouldn't believe this?
I think another reason why, I mean, you talk about the zone of established facts,
Mm.
and perhaps misinformation led them to choose not to take the mRNA vaccine. I think one thing we keep hearing all the time is it's that there's a conflict, and it's not the misinformation that drove them not to take the vaccine. It's the fact that maybe somebody was making too much money off of this. How do you wrestle that? How do you tackle that debate. It's almost a circular conversation. But how do you tackle the conflict of interest component of this discussion?
Well, it's a tough one, but it is best served by really getting the facts straight. Okay, who was making money? Was that, in fact, something that the Congress and the administration, through Operation Warp Speed, put in place in order to provide a big incentive to do something that had never been done before, to develop and test and implement, with a lot of risk involved, a vaccine in just 11 months? That takes a lot of money, and the companies that succeeded did well. But that was kind of our choice by our elected representatives, including President Donald Trump in his first administration, who strongly supported that. Have people forgotten that, how that came about? Now, sure, you can ask, in our society, is our capitalism a little out of control here? Did the companies reap too many rewards for the work that they did? That's a serious conversation. Were they given too much of a generous push here financially? One could potentially make that case. But to argue that companies shouldn't make money when they generate products that are going to save lives would kind of put us in a different place than the American economic system. So on its face, it deserves a conversation, but it's hard to see why that's disqualifying for somebody deciding not to roll up their sleeve.
Well, so on that, let me follow up by saying, one of the things, like, I'd love for you to explain to us almost step by step, like how a bill becomes a law, how an NIH grant, in a way, like, our understanding is when the NIH approves of a grant, it then, if say it involves making a medication, then a company kind of swoops in, takes that, licenses it, and then they reap the rewards and they reap the profits from it. And in a way, I could understand as a taxpayer being like, yo, that's my money, and now you're taking it towards this thing. I guess do you empathize with sort of like looking at that kind of soup to nuts like timeline and being a little concerned about the amount of money that a company can make out of something that started off with, like Joe Schmo scientist wanting to come up with a cure? Like, help me understand, like, whether you see some, like, whether you have some empathy for that viewpoint.
I do. And let me explain how the current system works. And it's going to get us into a little bit of the weeds here about something called the Bayh-Dole Act, but I'll come to
Try
that.
us. We got this.
See you guys later.
Now, come on, Mark, stick with it. So the way in which NIH funds research is investigators who are from institutions all over the country, and about 10% of them in the NIH laboratory, its own intramural program, come up with ideas. And they are supposed to be bold and creative and innovative, and they are. And they send those ideas in the form of an application to NIH, who does a rigorous peer review by other experts to decide whether this is promising or not. Unfortunately, because budgets have been very tight and we're threatened to get vastly tighter, only about 20% of those applications are going to get funded. And I would say, from having been the NIH director for 12 years, probably 40% are really worth doing. So we're leaving a lot of great science on the table and have been doing so now for years because the budget was inadequate. The ones that get funded, then, they get a grant award and they get money and they're told, okay, you have to report every year on what you're doing, but let's see what you can accomplish. Some of them will, in fact, make a discovery that looks like it could be a product for the public. NIH doesn't make pills. So if you want that to happen, it needs to figure out a way to get translated and transferred into the private sector. This is our ecosystem of public and private, which is the envy of the rest of the world and is the reason that American biomedical research has absolutely dominated the world's productivity for the past several decades. It does mean that that company picks up the discovery as a license, and they then have to figure out, can they actually make the product, and will it get FDA approval, and then ultimately will they make some money? So they're taking a big risk here. If they succeed, even though the original idea was funded by NIH and by the taxpayers, NIH does not get payback because of the Bayh-Dole Act. The Bayh-Dole Act basically said that there is no carryover of payback of royalties to the institution, the university where the work was done. That is basically not going to happen. And it was done for a purpose now 40 years ago, because without that, there was relatively little tech transfer happening. And a lot of discoveries were happening and nobody was picking them up because the company was thinking, well, why should I do this if all the money's just going to go back to the government? So it's been a great success. Anybody who looks at Bayh-Dole would say that's another reason we have dominated the competitive arena of really innovative research in biomedicine. But it has made it possible for some companies to do really well without having to pay back for the fact that the original incentive, the original discovery, came from NIH funded research. I think it's a system that served us well, but it always deserves a closer look.
Oh, I got a
Right.
question. I got a follow up for you.
Yeah. That you just opened our
I got a follow up.
minds with that,
You open our minds. I have a lot of
Francis.
follow ups.
Boom.
I mean, in your book, if I'm remembering correctly, you said, I'm a Descartes man. Like, you show me the
I
facts,
was.
you're going to convince me. And then you changed.
I got over it.
You were like a Hume guy who was like,
Uh-huh.
my biases will come in. And so it's part fact, but part bias. And you said, if I'm, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said, like, I confronted my own biases. Like, if
Yes.
I'm publishing a study and people are sort of critiquing it, I'm going to hold them to a higher bar because my bias is that I was right. Like, I can imagine a lot of listeners saying that was a great description of a system, but this guy is biased to defend that system. What do you say to the people who are like, I don't buy this?
I think that's totally fair. They should ask that question. Yeah, and I was a Descartesian who said, or Cartesian, I guess is the right word. I think, therefore I am, and I've substituted that now with I think, therefore I am biased, because everything we do has that in there, and it's best to discover it. But that doesn't violate the fact that there is something called objective truth, and we still ought to try to find it. It may be harder because of our bias, but it's there. So if somebody doesn't like my description of our American ecosystem, then okay, delve into it. Look at the way in which this actually has worked. Point out some of the places it doesn't work so well. It's kind of slow. And the government part of this, frankly, sometimes tends to discourage really risky ideas and go for the things that are a little more likely to be successful. And that's not always good. There's so many ways NIH could be better. And I spent most of my 12 years there identifying those and trying to work on them, but it was far from a completed task when I left in 21. There's all kinds of that, but it has to be done thoughtfully, identifying places you can actually touch the system and make it better instead of what's happening now, which is the heartless, careless slash and burn of everything, which is the worst way to try to improve an institution. I'm sorry I had to kind of go there because what's happening right now at NIH is an absolute devastation of what has been the crown jewel of the federal government in many people's view, producing these kinds of amazing outcomes that have saved countless lives, alleviated suffering, and by the way, is one of the major reasons our American economy has been flourishing since World War II, because every dollar that goes into biomedical research has a return on investment, depending on who you ask, somewhere between 2 and 8-fold. The Human Genome Project that I had the privilege of leading cost the federal government over 13 years $3.5 billion. The return on that now is estimated over $1 trillion. Not bad for a little bit of effort. But you know what? If a genome project idea came along right now, where it would be such a good thing for the United States to lead, I don't think we would. Everybody's on the back foot. People are thinking of leaving the country. All of those opportunities that we thought would always characterize American science are now under serious and severe threat. No, make no mistake about this. This has never happened before.
So you don't
No,
think something like
Francis.
the Human Genome Project would be done now in the United States if that idea was
We
percolating?
might play a role. China would probably take the lead, and they would put the resources into it, and they would reap the benefits.
So, Francis, could you elaborate a little bit more about what else we see as lost? Because I'm one of those early career investigators who is part of that 75% who did start looking at positions globally. I love being here. I want to contribute to my research, but you already said that the 20% that were approved during your time at NIH, 40% should have been funded. Um, And now the budget being cut the way it is, that's going to go dramatically down. So what other things do you see we're losing in this process?
We're losing almost every aspect of our success story. But I particularly worry about young investigators. My former lab, I have probably the most capable graduate student I've seen in 30 years, who is just finishing his PhD. He'll get his degree from the University of Cambridge in the UK, but it's done jointly with NIH. This is the kind of student that normally by now would have had 5, 6, 7 postdoc opportunities in the finest labs doing the most exciting science. He has 0 because nobody is recruiting. They're afraid with these cuts that they're not going to be able to run their research projects, so they can't take on anybody new. So he's looking at Australia. I just talked to a former trainee of mine who's now a chairman of a department in a very notable research university. They haven't gotten a single dollar of grant money since April. It's just all been on hold. Not even things that were supposedly stopped, but they're not getting the awards. And labs are closing. His superstar cancer researcher has just announced he's moving to France. Another really highly qualified basic scientist is moving to Toronto. This is not hypothetical things that damage is happening. It is happening. And it's going to be very hard to turn it around. What we need, and what I'm working on right now, is to try to get in front of everyday Americans the stories of lives that have been saved by this, because I don't think people realize how that happens. When you hear from somebody with cystic fibrosis, who normally would be planning for their funeral, and instead they're planning a full life and retirement. That was all because of NIH research that was then picked up and commercialized. Hear from somebody who's cured of sickle cell disease. That would not have happened without our government investing over many years in how you do this kind of amazing gene therapy to cure that disease. Or you hear from somebody who has a child with stage 4 cancer, where it's the clinical trial being run by NIH that's keeping that child alive and maybe even looks like it might be a cure. And all of that is at risk. And people don't know that out in the heartland. We have done a bad job. This is on all of us in the scientific community of conveying to people exactly what this is all about. Only what, 15% of people in America even know what NIH does or what
Yeah.
it is.
Do
We've got
you
a lot of
think-
catch up to do.
Do you think, Dr. Collins, when, some of these lawsuits that have sued to get the grants back, do you have faith and trust that the grants are going to be, that they're going to be reinstated?
No, I don't see really strong evidence that those legal decisions are being acted upon, at least not very quickly. And meanwhile, groups are dissolving. Clinical trials that people were participating in for things like Alzheimer's and cancer have been stopped. You can't just start those back up again. You've lost that timetable of data. There are heartbreaking stories of people who are in clinical trials with a very limited timetable with stage 4 cancer, where the trial had to be stopped and they're just left without any other options because everything else had run out. Just deciding that you can put things on hold for a little while and then it'll be fine, that isn't how it works. Move fast and break things might have worked for Silicon Valley. It's a disaster when you're talking about life and death. We should really be thinking more about first do no harm, and that has been ignored.
Yeah, everybody is saying that there has to be a change, and even you recognize there has to be some sort of change. And a lot of scientists I talk to have this idea of the old guard in science, and perhaps you're the poster child for the old guard in science, right?
No.
This idea that funding often goes to research that fits the current mold, and more disruptive or risky ideas struggle to get through. You said, only 20% get funded out of the 40% that maybe deserve to be funded. But again, you're the one deciding. Do you think that the way that the NIH has been set up, maybe even under your watch, made it harder for the, I guess, out there ideas to get a fair shot? The surprise Human Genome Project or the surprise gene for, another disease. Like, were you able to have an open mind to get some of the MAHA agenda accomplished? Like, against chronic diseases, things like that?
Absolutely. And it's a fair question, but I don't know that people have really appreciated how much work has been going on, not just under me, but before me as well, to try to achieve those things. Focus on chronic disease, focus on high risk, innovative research. When I was NIH director, we started a whole new bunch of programs where people could come in with ideas that were truly bold without much in the way of preliminary data. And they would go into a separate peer review program where you were not judged because your idea was risky. It was supposed to be. And those programs, I think, if you look at their productivity, because they've been around long enough, are actually dollar for dollar producing more in the way of exciting outcomes than the traditional way. Although they're also producing a lot of flameouts of things that didn't work, but that's supposed to be the way it is. We were making that transition in a very intentional way. And in terms of why it's only 20%, that's because of the budget. That's not because that would be my decision. I would fund 40% if it was there. But we've lived under budget constraints that have failed to live up to the potential of the science, both in terms of making discoveries and building the economy for many decades. The Congress has never quite seen it possible to do what, in a purely economic analysis, would have made more sense, which is to double the current NIH budget. And now instead, we're talking about cutting it in half, the exact opposite of what an economic argument would say we should do, not to mention what it means for those kids and adults who are still waiting for answers to diseases we don't have solutions for. And I do take offense at the fact that we haven't paid enough attention to chronic disease, because if you look at the way in which NIH funding is addressing things like diabetes and heart disease and kidney disease and Alzheimer's disease, it is a vast proportion of the budget, and well should be for quite some long time. And to simply say, well, we're going to take care of something that's been neglected flies in the face of the facts.
Do you know what it
Did
is,
you?
Dr. Collins, on that? You're right, because I have kind of seen the tension in that conversation, because I think a lot of folks in MAHA are talking about, for once and for all, we're going to make chronic disease front and center, and a lot of folks in science and public health are like, what are you talking about? We've been doing this for years. I wonder if there is like where those two lines intersect on the axis. I'm not good at math, so stick with me here. I wonder if it's on the outcomes, because the one thing I do sort of see a little bit of truth, and that it stumps me, honestly, Dr. Collins, when they say, well, then why are our outcomes continually so bad? That all
Right.
this money we're using to invest, the Office of Childhood Obesity, the Office of Diabetes, the Office of Tobacco Smoking, although that one, I think there's very visible ground that it's been working. But how do you make the case that all that investment, when the outcomes continue to be so bad, has been worthwhile?
No, it's a really good question. And I do think it's one thing to do the research and identify what interventions would be successful for things like obesity or smoking or dietary influences on heart disease. It's another to figure out how to implement that. There are two barriers to the implementation that we haven't got very good solutions to. One is that our healthcare system does still a lousy job of investing in prevention. And that's what we're talking about. If you want to reduce chronic disease, you want to prevent it, not treat it better once it happened. And our healthcare system has just been lousy at that because no insurance company wants to pay up front for prevention when somebody's downstream benefits of that prevention may accrue to some other company because they move from one place to the other. Our system really sucks when it comes to coming up with economic incentives for prevention. And the other is just human behavior, which we don't understand well enough to know how to be effective in helping people. The fact that we have this crisis of obesity is one thing to say, well, we know what you need to do is diet and exercise, and maybe some GLP-1 receptor agonists now as well. But we haven't really got a strong enough program to figure out how to motivate people to take those steps, especially if they're feeling okay now, in order to avoid that diabetes tomorrow. And that shouldn't, I think, be then laid at the feet of the research system for not having done the research. I think we have a lot of answers. They're just not getting implemented.
Yeah, I think we're sort of at our final question. and there's another side to you that we it's for a different podcast, perhaps, but it's all about your spirituality.
Mhm.
And I know you've written about it and thought a lot about it. I'm sort of wondering, we've talked about this moment that could have been a golden age for science and discovery right now, colliding with this populist movement that's saying we're sick and we got to change course radically. Like the spiritual side of you, do you pray that we find some common ground, that that we begin to trust each other? Like, is this how deeply do you think and reckon with this moment?
Thanks for asking, Tom. Yes, I do pray. My faith is very important to me. It's how I start every day, and that's with prayer and usually reading some part of the Bible or some other devotional. And I am so deeply distraught about what's happening to our society. We're good, honorable people, which is most of us have fallen into this space of being suspicious of each other and clinging together in these tribal alliances that may or may not be good for us. And then accepting information that maybe isn't actually true. The idea that your faith ought to be a source in those circumstances of finding the truth, which is certainly what my faith of Christianity is all about, should be helpful, but it doesn't seem to be working so well. Anything we can do in that space to try to start talking to each other again. And the last chapter of my book, The Road to Wisdom, is all about that. How do we break down these barriers? Go and have a glass of wine or a coffee with somebody who you really disagree with and figure out again, how do we listen to each other? Listen not just to plan your response, but listen to understand. That's what I've learned from Braver Angels. That's what I think you're trying to do with this podcast. But you're working against a pretty tough headwind of polarization, divisiveness, much of it driven by politics. And I'm afraid it's infected science in a terribly distressing way, setting aside things that are established facts as, well, that's just somebody's political point of view. When you mix almost anything with politics, whether it's science or it's religion, you just end up with politics. And the space we're in right now is making our very existence deeply unpleasant in many ways and unproductive and even dangerous to our future. And somehow we have to figure out collectively, we the people, how to turn that around. I don't think our politicians are going to solve this. I don't think the media writ large is necessarily designed to solve this because a lot of that's polarized too. It's up to us. And with conversations like this and the willingness to really listen hard to information you really didn't want to hear from somebody with a different perspective, but then understanding where they're coming from, maybe we've got a chance of flourishing again instead of just fighting with each other.
Wow, hear, hear, Dr. Collins. We couldn't agree more. It's funny. We've all ended up at the same place, which is, I think, having conversations and genuinely having them with people who may think differently from each other, but doing it not with prepared answers in mind, but to genuinely break bread and try to walk a mile in their shoes is really the way to do it. We couldn't agree more. That's what we hope to do and strive to do. And thank you for encouraging us to do that. You're one of the reasons we are doing that. So I just want to thank Dr. Collins. Thank you for your service. You've devoted your life to public service. And we're really grateful to coming on our podcast. Why should I trust you?
Glad to be with you. It's been a really interesting conversation. Keep it up, you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you so much.
So that is our show today. I am Brenda. He is Dr. Mark. She is Maggie Bartlett. He is Tom Johnson. Send us questions, comments at questions at whyshouldItrustYou.net, and we will see you right back here next week.